Good afternoon. Welcome everyone. I'm just going to wait for a second to see more of our participants joining. You'll be able to find captions for this session, which I'll start properly in a moment. We were also supposed to have sign language interpretation for this session. So apologies, we've not been able to, we've had a cancellation for our BSL interpreters, which is unfortunate, but we are looking at ways to record this session in future with sign language interpretation. This session will be following a webinar format. I'm starting with some housekeeping before I explain who we are and why we're here. We're going to hear from each guest, and then we'll have a short pause for breath, and then we'll be moving into a Q&A session, which has been developed in community with the Donut Economics Scotland Network, planned and curated by Vinashree Solanki and Rebecca Lee, both on today's panel, and joined by Nani Jansen Reventlow and Asher Hemp. So my name is Kim Simpson. I use she, her pronouns. I also use they. I have no issue with they. And I'll be moderating this panel today on marginalised leadership, on climate and economic justice as part of Global Donut Days online. We hope to highlight the connections between global majority and disabled perspectives and climate justice work. So I am a pretty frazzled looking 42-year-old white lady. The hair is giving a little bit of Elizabeth I vibes today. I have red curly hair. It's definitely not natural. And I am modeling marginalised leadership because I am joining today from my bed in my dressing gown due to not pacing properly for the rest of this week. So I am flaring up a little today. I'm the head of Equalities, Diversity and Inclusion at Creative Scotland, which is the national funder for arts for Scotland. And prior to this, I led Remembering Together, which was a COVID community memorial project delivered by Green Space Scotland, marking and honouring the people and things that we both lost and gained during the COVID pandemic. And before that, I was an independent producer, curator, strategist, and coach, working across the arts nationally and internationally, primarily with marginalised practitioners and artists, and also as a marginalised and disabled person myself. I'm definitely the least interesting person on this panel today and simply here to hold the conversation. So I'm going to finish up just by saying that equality, diversity and inclusion is a strategic priority for Creative Scotland, as is environmental sustainability. So I'm really delighted to be here to learn from the panellists themselves about where these areas meet. The other thing I'd like to say before we hand over to our panelists is we're going to be centering our needs a little bit in this conversation. We have different ways of experiencing time and we're a chatty bunch. So you may hear me interrupt some of our panelists to bring them back to the conversation, just because we all can go off on little tangents and we don't have lots and lots of time, but it's not rude because we decided that we would do this before we started the conversation. At any point, if anyone needs to take, I'm speaking to the panel here, if you need to take a pause, a breath, a moment away from the screen, please do. We're going to be supportive and looking after each other as much as possible. And then in terms of our attendees, if you have questions, please do feel free to put them in the Q&A section. We probably won't come directly to your questions in this session, because the questions that we have been curated by community members, and so we would like to keep to those. But if there are questions that are relevant to those areas, then I'll probably try and fold them in. And if not, then we will also have a conversation afterwards just by email to see if there's anything we would like to respond to from those questions as well. So without further ado, I'm going to move from one digital tool to another and introduce our first speaker. Nani Jansen Reventlow is an internationally recognized human rights lawyer and founder of Systemic Justice, the first Black-led majority BPOC organisation in Europe working to radically transform how the law works for communities fighting for racial, social and economic justice. Thank you, Nani. I will let you introduce yourself and talk a bit about your work.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Kim, and really lovely to be here. Really looking forward to learning from the other panelists. Description of myself, I'm a fairly light-skinned Black woman of mixed Black West African and white European heritage. I'm 46 years old. I have dark hair, which I wear backwards, and which I wear back, and I have on a very bright red sweater today. Bit of cheer in what is a strange day, I think, for everyone, with the outcome of the U.S. elections. I'm sitting in a living room, which is not my own. I'm currently traveling, so I'm in an Airbnb, but there's a really big banana palm leaf behind me on one side and a bit of artwork, questionable nature, on the other side of my other shoulder. I use she, her pronouns, by the way. So what I'll speak about for the next few minutes is about our work at Systemic Justice and eco-ableism. And I will reference a Black, Indigenous and people of color perspective a lot, but I want to make sure to kind of like flag in advance that for us, this includes disabled people. We work intersectionally, so we look at all axes along which people are experiencing oppression. So just because I don't name everything every time, it doesn't mean that I'm not referencing those perspectives in that context. I'm just flagging this because I quite often get a what about type response, usually from white people. But I just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page about terminology. So Systemic Justice is a new organization that seeks to radically transform how the law works for communities that are fighting for racial, social, and economic justice. And as Kim just mentioned, we are the first Black-led, first majority Black and people of color organization in Europe that works on strategic litigation for racial, social, and economic justice through an intersectional lens. And with strategic litigation, I mean using the courts to create bigger change in law, policy, or practice by pursuing cases in tandem with other tactics, such as campaigning, advocacy work, policy work, etc. And by combining all of these things at the same time, you increase the chances of actually being able to make bigger systemic change. What we firmly believe in is that marginalized communities should be in the lead in the cases that concern them. And that's currently not often the case. Often you see situations where lawyers swoop in and they take over. So they actually kind of like take the leadership and the ownership away from the communities themselves. So what we're doing is building a new model of community-driven litigation, which makes sure that communities can set the agenda, that they can set the objectives, that they can set the narratives, and actually really design their own litigation work. And we're acting in service to community, kind of as a law firm for movements and collectives. So that's one thing that we do, actually working with communities to build community-driven litigation projects together with them. But we also work to build the knowledge and power of communities on strategic litigation, what it is, what it cannot do for their campaigns for change, so that they're in a better position to create the right setup for themselves, whether they work with us or with someone else. And we often do this by delivering workshops, which is based on our community toolkit for change, which you can find on our organization's website, but we'll also share that as a resource from this panel. And the other thing that we do is build a community of practice with litigating organizations that want to work in a more community-centered way, but who need a space to share, to learn, and build practices together. And we currently work on two thematic areas. One is climate justice, and the other one is social protection. So climate justice for us means the intersection between the fallout of the climate crisis and racial, social, and economic justice. So for example, right now you see a lot of cases in the headlines, in the news that have to do with climate, but those quite often have to do with things such as, state responsibility for emission targets or corporate accountability for pollution. But you barely see any cases that talk about the disproportionate way in which racialized people and socioeconomically disadvantaged people are harmed by, for example, air pollution. So the climate litigation that you're seeing right now is kind of taking a kind of a neutral, quote unquote, approach, but is not really acknowledging how some of us are being disproportionately harmed by the climate crisis right now. So we came to work on these two themes based on an extensive community consultation in which we asked communities across Europe what their priorities were and what the opportunities were that they saw for change. And that consultation showed that both climate justice and social protection, we look at housing, at healthcare, at education. So basically all the areas where governments should be providing access to essential services, but is doing A, less and less so, and B, particularly not doing that when it comes to specific groups. And then I'm thinking, for example, of people with a migration background, disabled people, LGBTQI plus individuals, etc. But both of those issues were very high on the list, and they were also underserved by litigation work that really took an intersectional perspective. In our conversations with community partners about climate justice in particularly, we consistently heard stories from activists about being excluded from policy spaces, about being pushed out of the frame by the big, white-dominated climate organizations, being pushed out of funding. People were saying things such as, yeah, we're being used as campaign props by these big organizations. We have to campaign for issues that are actually not essential to us, but it's the only way in which we can actually kind of participate in that ecosystem. And also that people were lacking spaces to connect with each other without a funder looking over their shoulder, because there's often gatherings, but then it's like funder curated, or it's an institution, but spaces that were actually their own. And all of that feedback led us to initiate the Building BPOC Climate Justice Power project, which consists of a speaker series, which you can also find on our website, where we're kind of looking deeper at the intersections of these different dimensions to the climate crisis. A podcast that names Whose Planet, which you can also find on our website and wherever you get your podcasts. And that podcast examines the climate emergency through the angle of air quality, rising sea levels, and also the cost of the green transition, by hearing both experts speak to the issues, but also personal stories from, for example, low-income neighborhoods in London, Roma communities in Romania, Indigenous communities in Scandinavia, island nations in the Caribbean, and it also has a very strong disability justice perspective in it. And the third part is a gathering that we hosted last month, which brought together activists, Black, Indigenous, and people of color activists from across Europe. And we basically did this work because the world's most marginalized communities are on the front lines of a climate crisis that they didn't create. So I mentioned just now the example of air pollution disproportionately harming Black people, people of color, and socioeconomically disadvantaged people. Disabled people are not only harmed by the climate crisis itself, but they're also harmed by the alleged solutions to it. So taking into account that disabled people, who make up 15% of the global population, are often left out of policy decisions. And in our podcast, we had disability justice activist and scholar Anna Landre discussing that they're often scapegoated also in environmental debates, in a way that basically their needs for essential resources, such as electricity or single-use plastics, are framed as some sort of threat to the environment. And there's often a lot of thoughtless measures being proposed without actually thinking through what the impact of having more more electronic vehicle charging stations has for space on a sidewalk or anything like that for people who need assistance for mobility, for example. So it's very important that we organize, and that and we are here to explore in which way the courts can help in your campaigns for anyone who's interested. And we can think about things such as challenging climate laws and policies that have been adopted without meaningful participation of marginalized people, which is what is required under the Aarhus Convention. You can think about overturning eco-ableist environmental decision-making, for example, policies on single-use plastics. You can think about enforcing the right to a healthy environment and making that actually effective when it comes to people who have different health conditions, or something like challenging climate emergency and disaster responses that are actually not disability inclusive by design. So the possibilities are endless.
Thank you so much, Nani. So rich, so much to think about there. And we're already starting to see where those experiences are connecting, intersectional and also, you know, sometimes separated marginalized communities. So thank you so much for that. We're going to come back with some questions after we've heard from the rest of the speakers. So next, we're going to be hearing from Asher Hemp, a multidisciplinary artist and trouble in parenthesis maker based in Edinburgh. They navigate solo and collaborative contexts to nurture care within our climate crisis, informed by queerness and disability justice, collective imagination, and accessibility that is creative, honest, and politically articulate. Thank you for joining us, Inc. I will let you take the floor.
Thank you, Kim. My name, is Ink, and my pronouns are they, them. I'm a youngish white person with a short beard, and I'm wearing a blue beanie and large headphones. I work as an artist making live art, visual art, and writing poetry. And I work as a facilitator and an advocate. And what unifies these three things for me is care. The theme of my work is care on a macro and micro level, informed by queerness and disability justice. For today, I've been specifically asked to consider disabled and queer perspectives of our climate crisis. But that is a massive area to cover in 8 minutes. So I was working out how to narrow it down, and I landed on mustaches. Specifically mustache fashion in the 1890s, which they were really thick mustaches. And this is something that I became aware of when seeking out the histories of climate science and disability organizing. Because we're often led to think about our climate crisis as like a pretty modern thing, which I think is like almost an excuse for like where we are with it. Like we're still figuring it out, getting to grips with it, and that's why we are where we are. But our scientific understanding of what we now call the greenhouse effect goes back to 1824. It predates the study of genetics and the theory of evolution. And by the time of the mustache fashions of the 1890s, a Swedish physicist and chemist had calculated by hand the exact correlation between the quantity of CO2 in our atmosphere and our global average temperature. If you consider the embodied knowledges, it goes back even further. Indigenous communities who experienced environmental apocalypse 500 years ago know that this isn't purely a crisis of science. In order to extract resources, the British Empire, alongside others, colonized cultures, globalizing homophobia and transphobia. Those extracted resources would fuel the climate crisis, and the propagated homophobia and transphobia has remained. Queer young people are disproportionately homeless across the world. In Scotland, 1 in 5 transgender young people experience homelessness before the age of 25. In Kingston, Jamaica, many LGBT young people live in makeshift camps outside of the city, which are incredibly vulnerable to floods and to hurricanes, at which point they are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis as an axis of creation of disability. The ecology of this crisis as interconnected, conspiring issues is understood in an embodied way by those who live it in an embodied way. And any argument that this is purely a crisis of science, that all we need to do is change the quantity of CO2 we pump into the atmosphere, are quashed by the realization that we have had over 100 years to navigate this crisis with that scientific perspective as the compass, and we still haven't really gotten anywhere. Earlier, I said mustaches, plural, because there were two guys. There was Arrhenius, the Swedish physicist doing the climate science, and then there was Francis Magin, a deaf campaigner involved in establishing the British Deaf Association, again in 1890. The British Deaf Association being commonly thought of as the first example of disabled people organizing together. Now, I was looking at the work of Francis Magin when I was planning a workshop for some climate activists. I do quite a lot of work with youth climate organizers in Scotland, and I often used to wonder why, when the connections between the themes of climate and disability are so present, why are they still so separate and disparate in our organizing? In 2024, disabled people are less likely to be involved in climate organizing than our non-disabled counterparts, in part due to a lack of physical and informational access. But knowing what the barriers are doesn't answer why these barriers have continued to be replicated and persist. And that's what the workshop I was planning sought to address. Anyway, as part of my prep work, I printed off pictures of Arrhenius and Magin, and I put them on my table. And then I went and came back a few minutes later, and I couldn't remember which one was which, because their faces, and specifically their mustaches, were so similar. The reason I'd printed a picture off of Francis Magin was to look at disabled organizing over the last 100 years. Which has often focused on campaigning for access to capitalism. Not all of it, but a lot of it, so like campaigns for buses to be more accessible, have predominantly argued that we need accessible public transport to go to work, to participate in capitalism, and to go shopping, again, to participate in capitalism, instead of thinking about how disabled experiences could inform the way we organize society. If I was to pick out two examples of common experiences disabled communities have that I think society could benefit from understanding further, they would be time and multiplicity. Disabled communities often have quite a specific relationship to time. When your body's needs are less up for being ignored and deprioritized, your notion of time often shifts from an external experience of a clock dictating what should happen when, regardless of circumstance, to a more collective and connected internal experience of like what is needed now. Unsurprisingly, this often means slowing down. When disabled people collaborate with each other, the importance of multiplicity often arises. We are where we are because we designed a society that said there was a right way and a wrong way of doing things. When you start to unpick that and start to try and meet people's needs, you find that everyone has different and sometimes clashing needs. And so to make something accessible isn't to make one new way of doing things an accessible way. It's rather to make many coexisting ways that can occur together. I picked these examples, time and multiplicity, because I've noticed that they are conversations that are starting to be had within climate organizing over the last 5 years. The conversation around climate and time being that if capitalism is a speeding up, then part of decarbonizing is a slowing down, a degrowth. And the conversation around multiplicity being that slowing down will look different for every community because it needs to meet the needs of the geography and the people and the animals and the plants that live there. I'm really happy that these conversations are starting to be had, and I'm not dismissing the work of Arrhenius and Magin, but I wonder where we could be today if they'd talked to each other when they were alive, or where we could be today if there had been space for greater biodiversity of perspectives when they were working rather than a monoculture of their mustaches. If the function of their work had been to exist in solidarity and supporting those who were more impacted by the issues they were working on than themselves. I talk about their stories to highlight the importance of the disability justice principle leadership of the most impacted, to acknowledge what happens when we neglect it for 100 years, and why it's essential that we value it in our labours and our organising day to day. Now, there are many ways that it could and should show up, but for me, it's why I choose to work as an artist and through a creative practice, because these are all creative things. Talking climate action is imagining. It's a form of world building. Disability campaigning is, again, world building. It's changing the design of society. Caring for a disabled body is a form of storytelling, telling yourself the story that your worth is inherent to yourself rather than inherent to productivity. And taking a creative approach allows me to prioritize biodiversity over monoculture, nourishing and nurturing biodiversity of experience, story, and leadership. One of the most common misconceptions people have about the labour I choose to live is that I would like less, when in reality I'm asking for more. More collaboration, more sharing of experience and skills, more dreaming. I'm asking for abundance, demanding more people, plants, animals, living, held, breathing safely. For me to resist is not to be a killjoy, it's to be joyful, a commitment to care, micro and macro, to brush my teeth, reforest my hillsides and gather plastics from my beach. I'm going to shower and rest and sleep, positioning my slumber-slackened limbs to blockade new fossil fuel development projects. This care isn't quiet or tidy, but it chooses soft and gentle as a rowdy refusal to be useful, as direct opposition to the demands of capital, because the needs it seeks to meet are those of my body, earth, my home.
Thank you so much. Ink, so much in there. Yeah, I can see Rebecca's applauding. I'm sure our participants are as well. And such an interesting perspective alongside Nani's work as well. I'm not going to dwell too long between speakers to make sure we all hear from everyone we have on our panel. So next up we have Vinashree Solanki, who is oh, I'm sorry, I've got the wrong thing. So we'll hear from Vinashree Solanki, a designer and creative practitioner, passionate about everything design, with years of experience in social innovation, circular economy, climate justice, and planet-centered design. Vinashree is also organiser of Donut Economic Scotland Network, connecting cross-sector people from Scotland and place-based transformative projects that are regenerative and distributive in nature. Thank you, Vinashree. I'll let you start your presentation.
Thanks, Kim. And I will add a little bit to my introduction here. So my name is Vinashree. My pronouns are she, her. I'm joining this session from Glasgow, and I'm an Asian Indian woman with long black hair. I'm wearing a pink top today and glasses. And as Kim said, I'm really passionate about everything design and enjoy working in the space of design innovation and design for social impact, and especially climate justice. And I'm really inspired listening to Nani and Ink right now, and lots of words actually, but such beautiful, work that they're doing. So I would like to share my work as well. So I'm a service designer, and my key strengths are co-designing with communities, especially those that are usually underrepresented and vulnerable people. Also, being an Indian living in Glasgow, I often find myself to be the advocate or voice for global majority community here in Scotland. And on that note, let me share a project that I'd recently done. I'll share my screen and talk you through some of the slides. Oh, all the screen sharing practice didn't help. Can you see the full screen?
We can see your slides in full. We can see the presenter version. Sorry, Vinashree.
I think this is
Perfect. Yeah, perfect.
amazing. So this project I'm sharing here is called CULTIVATE. It places creativity at the heart of climate justice, and we developed actions with local communities across the Tay region in Scotland. It was led by Creative Dundee and funded by Creative Scotland's Culture Collective. In the center here, if you see in the blue circle is me. My project aimed to work at a grassroots level, engaging with people of diverse ethnic backgrounds in Dundee, and also giving them agency to realize, express, and share their climate responses through a creative medium. Alongside me, you'll see these other amazing creative practitioners. They covered other areas like Angus and Perth, and they worked with communities of young adults and those with low income. So I designed creative tools to engage with this intergenerational group of women and children. They were all people from diverse ethnic backgrounds from over 15 different countries from the global majority countries, but living in Dundee in Scotland. Now, climate justice conversations can become quite vast, complex, and tricky at times. So what I did was broke down these overwhelming concepts into simple, digestible formats, finding examples from our everyday lives. Throughout, I used co-design methodologies to engage with this group. The idea was so doing things together to find out the gaps in the climate narrative and how we could together frame the response for climate justice. I created spaces for climate conversation, starting from the group's lived experiences and offering opportunities for them to share feelings of climate anxiety, personal stories, and any questions they may have around climate justice and how it impacts their personal lives. So I have background in product design as well as circular economy. So I explored the Sustainable Development Goals as SDG number 12, which is responsible consumption and production. It led us to discuss various themes like how capitalism is deep-rooted in our way of living, what we buy and how we consume. It has led to inequalities in the societies and people running after fast fashion or buy and throw away culture. As a group, we really dreamed of equality and empowerment of women. I also heard diverse voices, experiences, and actions. The stories shared within the group were intergenerational. So some shared things that their grandmom did or grandparents did to what their kids are doing right now. We spoke about cultural differences, lifestyle differences, culture of food. Yes, food was our universal language. We shared a lot through food. We spoke about the waste we created and how some of us are also trying our best to upcycle them. One prominent insight we found was how the language of climate was limited. Now, language other than English often lack an extensive vocabulary for discussing climate-related matters. This can be attributed to the fact that countries in the global south, climate change isn't always a primary concern. They continue to grapple with issues like poverty or scarcity of fundamental human requirements, political instability, big social issues, and more. So the conversation on climate change remains conspicuously absent from their everyday discussions. Conversations on power and privilege also emerged quite often in our workshops. We discussed inequalities, especially that women face, unequal distribution of wealth and power, even global north-south cultural differences that impacts carbon contribution. You must imagine here that these are women coming from countries from the global south and living in the global north. It reinstated the stark truth of how intertwined the social and environmental issues are, and how can we consider intersectionality in relation to ecology. My core idea for this project revolved around reimagining tomorrow. How might we collectively start thinking long term, be more speculative in our actions, and plan for future generations? As a family or a community, or even as a human, as Vinishri, we tend to foresee the future in the next 10 years or maybe 15 years. How can we extend it now to 30 years or more? So for reimagining that positive tomorrow, we need people to not only understand the nuances of climate change, but also embed it in their actions and day-to-day living. In this slide, the pictures that you see, I've particularly put together pictures of those women who really embraced that journey, really embodied the role of climate champions, amplifying the climate justice voice in their community, in their workplaces, as their social positioning, and even going back in their families. The project culminated in this beautiful, brilliant exhibition, which gave a representation to people who usually find themselves underrepresented. They felt empowered and, moreover, heard and appreciated. It was a celebration, through this exhibition. It allowed for a showcase of their ideas and creativities. As a group, they even raised questions and gave ideas for future making to the wider audience, especially decision makers, funders, and people in the position of power. Impact of this project can be measured through the lives and families it touched and how the group emerged as climate champions, taking a lead in their communities and really championing climate action in Dundee. I'm ever so grateful for working with this extraordinary group of humans, and as a designer, I've grown immensely in the process. A quote that really resonated with this group was by Bell Hooks. The quote says, "Rarely, if ever, are any of us healed in isolation. Healing is an act of communion." This quote beautifully emphasizes the importance of being in a community and how therapeutic our communities can be. Thank you so much. I'll hand it over to you, Kim.
Thank you so much, Vinishri. Those words, reimagining a positive tomorrow and healing as an act of communion, are just reverberating in my mind now. Thank you again. And now we're going to hear from Rebecca Lee, whose practice addresses economic justice issues through accessibility, marginalised leadership initiatives, and design justice. Rebecca is an invisibly disabled, prize-winning design researcher, accessibility lead, and universal recognition movement founder. And the universal recognition movement is a global accessibility positive movement led by disabled creatives, unlocking the power of accessibility to create services, environments, and products that are fit for our future. Thank you so much, Rebecca. I will hand over to you.
Thanks, Kim. Just bear with me while I share my screen. Hi everyone, I'm Rebecca, pronouns she, her or they, them. I'm a white woman in my late 30s and I have long curly hair. I'm a freelance design researcher and consultant working in service and policy design. I specialise in accessibility and co-production. I am invisibly disabled myself. I sometimes slur or lose my words, so my script is visible today to support my access needs. I have been the equity and accessibility lead for Deal this year, supporting global organisers in dedicated learning sessions in preparation for their local Global Donut Days. In 2022, I founded the Universal Recognition Movement, and as already mentioned, we're an accessibility positive movement led by disabled, deaf and neurodivergent innovators, and we help everyone to universally recognise accessible futures that are fit for us all. You are partners with service providers, policymakers and organisations to help improve equity and accessibility in your context. Last year, you are and I partnered with Deal and ran a co-produced project with marginalised leaders from around the globe to support you fab folks in delivering local donor economic events where more of your communities, especially those typically excluded, could take part, organise and lead with you. We developed a toolkit to assist you in improving accessibility for your own Global Donut Days activities, and the resources from this partnership project are now available to you in the PDF that accompanies this workshop, this session, so do check those out. Earlier today, I delivered a workshop on how disability theories can help us to shape new value systems and incentives that bring us closer towards a safe and just economy. Inc. mentioned time, we mentioned time in that workshop, so it's lovely that that's resonating. I mentioned how disabled insights and disabled leaders often go unheard. One of the key barriers is a lack of accessibility and investment, especially for initiatives shaped by experts with lived expertise. There is a disability justice saying, "Nothing about us without us." Universal recognition goes further to highlight that it is less than a mess without us. In tough times, whilst we face the global challenges of inequality, oppression, and the climate crisis, working with marginalised leaders is essential, especially if we want to develop robust measures to mitigate harm and aspirational alternatives that incentivise action and hope. We can't do this if the folks facing the harshest conditions of these crises aren't enabled to lead as top decision makers on how we navigate these challenges. If we aren't in the room to demonstrate how to embrace diversity or to propose alternative action to current action that has caused everyone so much harm, then there is a problem. Marginalised leaders are the experts already experiencing a harsh world not designed with us in mind, and persisting, loving, and caring for each other and the planet regardless. We need to get marginalised organisers a seat at the top decision-making table, and quickly. But marginalised leadership can't flourish in environments where we are coming up against barrier upon barrier, where there is far more hardship and financial risk. Marginalised households face a cost of living crisis far greater than those with relative financial security. If we have a job, a home, rented, or one that you live in, if we know where our next meal is coming from, if we can navigate a world unassisted, then we are living in high privilege. Disabled people are already far more likely to be exploited within work or excluded from safe or just economic participation. Yet when projects in social change that are for the public good arise, marginalised folks are expected to donate their time, volunteer, participate for minimal expenses, navigate funding systems that haven't been designed around their needs. If you are asking funding applicants to answer, how will they work with marginalised groups on your form, but you aren't asking them if they are already a marginalised run initiative, then there is an issue in who you are assuming is applying. If there aren't any marginalised folks in secure long-term paid positions in your organisation, isn't this part of the problem? Are there marginalised folks on payroll in positions of decision-making power? Do they decide policy or strategy or where the money is distributed? Are you hiring marginalised owned businesses for your contracts? Do you have an additional budget for investing in access beyond the typical funding pot? Do you know if your funding application process is accessible? Is it accessible to the people in the image on the above slide? Doing the work of dismantling unfair power dynamics requires dismantling unfair power dynamics in the way that we work. There is a great resource called the Ladder of Co-Production that can help us. The ladder shows us a framework for how we can work better together. At the bottom, we have methods where financial power dynamics are unbalanced, moving up to the top where they are in harmony. What does this actually mean for people in positions of financial power working with marginalised leaders? In doing two, we have folks in positions of power try to correct what they believe is wrong with people. Marginalised people are blamed for their circumstances rather than the systems that marginalise them. In doing four, we have folks with the most societal power put forward their own ideas for how to address issues of marginalisation, and people are consulted. In doing with, folks work together and are equitably compensated for their work. Those who created the work retain ownership. If we apply a disability justice lens, we can start to unpack the consequences of each method. The doing two approach could be an example of ableism or discrimination, i.e. folks in positions of power try to coerce marginalised people who they view as lesser. Marginalised folks might in response internalise shame about neutral or positive aspects of themselves, such as their disability. In doing four could create unsustainable situations of tokenism, disability washing, or charity, i.e. folks in positions of financial power retain ultimate control and power imbalances remain intact. Bias and assumption can creep in. Marginalised folks may feel infantilised, frustrated, and ultimately powerless. Doing with provides huge scope and potential for disability and design justice, i.e. folks in positions of financial power hand over that power and share it equitably. There is scope for marginalised folks to co-lead or independently lead. Typically excluded communities are financially compensated for their work. This can be liberating and enables investment in needed marginalised leadership. We need a new model for philanthropy and investment that is accessible, that doesn't wait for folks to apply, to be experienced, or to already be in the room. We need philanthropy that seeks folks out where they are already doing the grassroots work. We need philanthropy that invests and resources marginalised leaders, because this is an investment that would plant the seeds of a world wealthy in equity and fairness, where we can all resiliently flourish and courageously face the challenges that we are up against. Now, my contact details are in today's resources if you would like to connect and collaborate with us towards this effort. And I will now stop sharing and hand us back to Kim.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. You also get a gold star for being the only person who delivered your presentation completely in time. In fact, there's the alarm going off right then. May I suggest that we just take a moment to have a few breaths and gather ourselves after all of those incredible reflections from our panelists and speakers. I know that I will be really reflecting on everything that you've all said in this session, and just so fascinated to hear all the different perspectives and angles that you've taken, and starting to see those links as well. So for ourselves and also for the participants, we're just going to take a minute or two. We'll wait till Rebecca comes back. And I'm just going to sit quietly and breathe. And I hope you'll do the same. I'll smile occasionally so you don't think that I've just frozen on the screen. I think the things that are floating around my mind after hearing all that is this idea of disproportionality. Certainly a very strong theme. And I've kind of jotted down disproportionality, time, multiplicity, but then also persistence, love, and care, which also feel like they really came through really strongly. So much to reflect on. The next part of our hi Rebecca. The next part of our time together, we're going to move to a Q&A session. As I said earlier, do feel free to pop questions in the chat, and if we can fold them in, we will, but we will be focusing on the questions that were developed by members of the Donut, I've forgotten the name of it, Network Scotland. And too many pages moving around. This is Marginalised Leadership in Action. So the first question that I guess what we're moving to now is, from hearing about all of the work that you're doing and the fact that you're all coming to this space with your own lived experiences of marginalisation in some way. This next part is really focusing on some of the ways that we exist in this world of climate justice. So the first question, and I think we'll come to you first, Nani, if that's okay, is how do you look after yourself when leading in a space that might also make you vulnerable personally?
This is an excellent question to which I do not have an excellent answer, I should say in advance. So I'm not brilliant at taking care of myself. I'm particularly not brilliant in making sure that I pace myself and that I take enough time out. I still very much kind of like feel the the need to kind of keep on going, to kind of like do the work and so on. And that's not a sustainable way of doing things. And I'm learning that very much at the moment. So I'm very much in the process of learning to set boundaries. And I think to kind of go back to the question of how do I look after myself? The ways that have worked for me are finding people who have similar experiences as you do. And that sounds like always like a really obvious one, but there is just something I find at least like really wonderful about not having to explain anything at the outset, right? You can just kind of like go straight into the conversation about what you experience. People, it resonates with the other person. They know because they've had similar experiences as you have. So that kind of like creates a natural atmosphere of empathy and understanding, which is super helpful. It also leads to quite often much better advice than you would get from anyone else on how to navigate certain situations that turn out to be challenging. But also another thing that I do try to do more of is kind of like being more intentional, more deliberate about how I want to engage and the degree to which I want to engage in which spaces and in which way. Also just to kind of, think in advance, how can I create buffers for myself to, offload potentially or just process, but also to make sure that it doesn't become like this relentless kind of like endless stream of things that you have to either kind of like hold or push back against, etc. So there's something there about creating more space. I think, at least for me, that kind of gives me, a bit more of time to kind of do what you just did. Like take a pause, just take a moment, take a breath, and you can kind of like let some things go, or just reflect on how it affected you and things like that. I hope that makes some sense at least.
Gorgeous. Yeah, absolutely. I really hear the sort of buffers and boundaries, this idea that I think you really reminded me actually of Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown, and this idea of bird murmurations, and that actually you can choose how much you exert, especially when you're working in community with others, and that we don't have to just be at this level of like, all the time. We can come in and out according to our needs, and that's a really positive thing as well. I wonder, can I come to you, Rebecca, with the same question? I'm just working my way along my screens. So Rebecca, and then Ink, and then Vinishri on this question, if that's okay. So how do you look after yourself in this potentially vulnerable making space, or where you might be dealing with misjudgment and bias and things like that as well?
Yeah, so this one is really close to my heart because I'm often in spaces where I'm directly impacted as well. And you have to, I think it's about how we navigate relationships with each other and the people that we're working with. Nani mentioned boundaries, and I think that is one of the key things. It's sort of working out like how much we are willing to tolerate and sort of working out what our own values are. And I think it's a really good thing. It's something I've done recently with some local community organisers, is working out what your manifesto is for your values and what your boundaries are, like in a group, but also like personally for you. And that, when you found your people, that becomes an easier thing to decide. And I also think when you're working in relationships, when you're in these spaces where you're vulnerable and there are people outside of your experience who you're working with, it's around folks' willingness to learn. And that can be kind of a litmus test for whether that institution or those folks in decision-making power kind of deserve your time and expertise. Because if they're not flexible and they're not willing to learn, then that's a bit of a red flag. If there's, if it's kind of bordering on, making too many mistakes and not being, willing to think of things from different people's perspectives, then that can kind of border on abuse. I mean, we need to be really open to people's learning journeys, and I think it's quite clear when people are trying, and when it's a effort that everyone's trying to work on together. But yeah, when it borders on it's happening too many times, there's something wrong there. It's not quite right. And lastly, like another really big one for me, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier in my presentation, is that if we're being asked to educate others, so in institutions or organizations, don't take on work that isn't being paid for, because it should be a bit of a hard line, because in a donut economy, your financial security and safety should be part of your self-care, because if it's precarious, you can't look after yourself. And I think often, we want to educate, we want to be understood, so we can give a bit too much sometimes. And actually, I think it's about, as a network or a group or a community kind of going, no, hang on a minute, that institution has money and it should be paying people for what is essentially your expertise. And also, don't take on huge problems individually, because we can't do that, and that's massive. So trying to share it amongst a group so we can work on things together, address issues together. I think that's a really massive one for me.
Yeah, I really relate to lots of what you were saying there. Sorry, I'm getting some funny feedback. Particularly around, well, I was really hearing this sense of being reflective and tuned into yourself, and when you're going over what you can actually realistically offer something, and that need for something in return, and sort of that willingness to learn, that openness. So that's probably an invitation for everybody listening. In what ways can we be open and learning in these environments? Ink, can I come to you on the same question? Thank you.
I think I'd like to take the thread of being deliberate about the spaces we engage in and take that a bit further.
Please do.
There was something that I was taught or offered years ago in climate organizing and activism-y spaces around theories of change. And I can't remember the words they used, but what I've remembered the concepts as is if you want to really simplify it down, you have three categories of reform, deconstruct, and building alternatives. So you have campaigns or projects that seek to reform the status quo, you think of it as working from the inside, and then you have projects that are outside of that and are trying to deconstruct them and bring them down. And then you have projects that are just ignoring the status quo and are doing their own thing, building their alternatives, getting on with it, so that then if these are gone, then there's something left for us to work with. And what comes along with this idea is that none of these work on their own. They all need each other to make change. And I'd applied this often to the campaigns I was involved in, but not so much to the work I was doing, the paid work I was doing. And then one day I was like, oh wait, the paid projects I do in the arts, they fit into these categories too. And often there's a disparity between the levels of, you can trace the levels of funding that projects get. Reform projects often get quite a lot more money, but will be less radical, and dividing the work I do into these categories allows me to be more strategic in terms of I might need to do a reform project so I can pay my rent. But alongside that, I need a project that's building alternatives so that my heart is functioning. And that means that when I go into those spaces, then I know why I'm there as well. And allows me to be there with a bit more. I'm not asking it to give me everything. I'm only looking to get that part of it out of it. So I think that's really helped me.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful way of thinking about it, actually, Ink, because there's something about we live in the world that we live in, and we want to create the world that we are going to live in, but there's a reality that we're in at the moment, and finding a way to exist in that reality without feeling like you're completely compromising yourself. A really powerful reflection. Thank you. And last but not least, Vinny, what would you say in terms of caring for yourself when you're working in this space?
Yes, thanks, Kim. And thanks, Inc. I really like your advice. And I think, and just to add here, these questions put to the panel were created by members of Universal Recognition Movement that Rebecca leads. And they will be really happy because they had asked these questions, and they would be really happy to listen to Inc. your response and take so much from that. Coming back to the question, I think I agree with what Nani said and Rebecca said. It's all about pausing and reflecting. It is also not carrying that emotional burden of the project, but to add something to what Rebecca and Inc. already said about funding of the project. I think an example I can share here is about a project which Kim, you had introduced me to, was the Remembering Together project, where we were designing a COVID memorial. So we were working with the community groups and talking about COVID. And at that time, COVID was still going on, the pandemic was still on, and we had very difficult conversations with people who had lost family members or were really going through loss in different ways. So in projects like that, although the budgets are tight, if we can, fit in the support structure. So for example, in that project, we had a counselor by our side. So along with me in the workshops, a counselor would be there to support not only me, but also the community members, or just being there in that space helps shows that the support is already available and people have access to it. So building those kinds of support structures within the project or the budget of the project really helps in caring for ourselves and also for our community.
I'm really glad you mentioned budgets, Vinishri, because sometimes it is, the money is important, and sometimes having the resource, well, more than sometimes, that is a very real thing, that having budgets and money attached to the things that are important, that show where we place our value, is really, really critical. We've got just about 13 minutes left, so I'm going to suggest that we maybe only have time for one more question with the full responses that we're getting from our amazing panelists. So I was wondering, there's one question here that I wonder, I thought it was quite interesting because the question is, you all come from marginalised backgrounds. How did you get into this work and roles with decision-making power? And one of Ink's immediate responses was he was wondering about the notion of leadership being conflated with employed roles. And I just thought that was really interesting because personally, I see leadership as something that can emerge from lots of different places. So I wonder if we could ask that question. You've come from particular perspectives, and you all have a different role in terms of decision making, and leadership perhaps is the kind of thing I'm thinking about there. Can we start with you, Vinishri, this time?
Definitely. So maybe not leadership, but maybe how we get to that, decision-making power, or how we get to positions and roles like that is something that I would like to contribute here. So in my case, it was all about, the passion for working in the climate sector. And I was already working with various underrepresented and marginalized communities. And bringing that together helped me realize that there was a massive gap in the climate justice sector. So what I did was, I've tried to continuously train myself and continuously learn about theories and things, also educate myself on various subjects like circular economy or permaculture design, and train myself to be able to lead that space. I think that has been my journey, and let's see how we go forward from there. But yeah, that's me.
Thank you, Vinishri. Who wants to come in next on that one? Nani, would you be willing to pop in there?
Willing, absolutely. I guess there's two dimensions to the question. One is like the area of work, and the other thing is something about decision-making power or leadership. So the thematic kind of like side of things, that's basically just because we work in service to community, and this is where the community consultation process took us to climate justice and to social protection. So we followed that lead, and we saw that opportunity that I was talking about earlier to create spaces and to build BIPOC power on climate justice, and just hope that by facilitating those exchanges, more will spring from that, and that's essentially what we're hoping. I guess there's something in there also about I think it was framed originally as roles with decision-making power, and I think I agree with you, Kim, that like leadership is a lot more than that, and you can lead from all different kinds of roles. I think that there is a combination in there about indeed like continuous curiosity and always wanting to learn and always wanting to kind of do new things. But also, I should say, like we live in a white supremacist society. A lot of it also has to do with luck, and sometimes also proximity to other decision makers, etc. I think the degree to which you are perceived as someone who's going to challenge things too much or not also has a big role to play there. So I do think that it's important to name that. And I definitely think that I've become much more rebellious after taking on any leadership roles than I was when I kind of stumbled into that. So probably people will find me a lot more difficult now than they did at the time. I just want to just put that on the table as well, because we all operate in this system, and I like to move away from the idea that it's just if you're talented and driven, you can just kind of go anywhere. It's just not true.
Thank you so much for saying that as well, Nani, because I do think that needs to be named, and it's certainly something I can see that I've benefited from as well personally in terms of my own role and the work that I do. It's a lot about other people kind of being on board with it and supporting and all the rest of it. And also, I'm disabled, but I am also white, and I understand that that's a huge privilege. Weirdly, I also have height privilege because I'm like 6 foot tall. So this does actually help me in a lot of environments. Kind of strange, but anyway. Rebecca, would you like to come in on that one? How you got there? What brought you to it, and your decision-making role within this work as well?
Yeah, so this one for me has been a bit of a roller coaster and a bit of a tough one, and I wanted to kind of bring that perspective into it. So I guess it sort of started through care of loved ones. So partly I didn't really have a choice. So when my dad became terminally ill, I ended up caring for him in unpaid care, and I just, it's an emotional one. So I just didn't want anyone else to go through what we went through. And of course that makes you vulnerable, which is why, I'm crying a little bit. But I think, when we're thinking about like, where does leadership come from? Like our leadership, my family's leadership came from advocacy, and also just from being really angry that my dad lost his agency and wanting to kind of reinstate that in any way that I could for him. And weirdly, through doing that, it made me kind of, I came into my own disabled identity. I've been chronically ill since I was a child, and I'd never really kind of stepped into that and gone, oh no, because it was making me notice access and barriers everywhere. And it helped me to sort of understand, how I needed to advocate and care for myself as well, because of what my dad was experiencing. So Yeah, I think championing that and championing that you don't need to come from this. There's not these really clever people in top decision-making rooms that know exactly what they're doing. Often they like desperately need us to advise them because they don't know, and they're disconnected, or they might be disconnected from their own experiences of interdependence and care for each other because of how our economy is and because of how our systems are. So yeah, I think learning and finding more support helped me to acknowledge that and work together with people that and finding community in that mission became really important. And also actually like to resonate with what Nani said as well. Like I also had a big ton of privilege. So my this is going to sound strange, but my gran passed away, and the inheritance from the selling of her ex-council house that she ended up owning enabled me to go and study in design innovation. Never gone into academia before that level, like it was not something that I'd done. And that's not to say that you need that kind of training, because you absolutely don't, but it is to say that you need people to invest in you, and you need patrons in this day and age where actually money isn't distributed in balance. It's not distributed fairly. I guess it's my invitation again to resource people. I'm really quite privileged, but I was probably one of the less privileged people in that position of being able to be educated in that way, and that's shocking. So we need to fund people and resource people, because we have a lot to offer.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rebecca, for sharing your experience, first of all, and also for being vulnerable with us and with the participants here. And also your point there about being able to access education. In Scotland, education is free, and you can study at degree level for free. So it's a huge privilege to be based here. Also, my own journey into this was a lot to do with my brother, who I looked after in his adult life and who passed away a few years back. So I can really relate again to that feeling of a personal care, a real live experience of interdependence, being what brings you here. I'm going to come to you, Ink, last on this question. If this wasn't necessarily one that you were super keen to answer, so if you want to answer a different question or offer a different kind of reflection, please do. But if you have something to say about this specific area and your sort of journey to and as a leading figure within this world.
I think it's an answer in progress.
And good. We like those.
And so the first bit of the question is around like, how did you get where you are? And I was involved in climate and social justice campaigning from when I was quite small. This was what my autistic mind fixated on and decided was what made my brain happy. But in about 2014, there was a campaign around a trade partnership between the EU and the US. And the campaigning was being done in this very academic way of talking to people in the street and telling them the arguments and sign this petition. But my brain doesn't work like that. And so I started writing this participatory street theatre for people to be involved in. And anyway, I wasn't really involved in formal education at that point, and I wasn't really from that point onwards. And I followed this path of this street theatre, and it got me to where I am now. And yes, we have like free education in Scotland, but it's free education for some people.
Yes.
It's free education if you can be there, and if you can navigate it. And I think it comes back to multiplicity. it's still pretty narrow. I work with children, and I see that for them as well. And broader, we can get broader broader leadership formats of consensus rather than top-down hierarchies when we have broader routes of learning and sharing and coexisting from a younger age, I think, is where I'm at with it.
I love that. I
now.
think that's a really, really beautiful response, and also a really beautiful invitation and picture of what it is that perhaps this group of people and some of the people here at the Donut Economics Action Lab are focused on and wanting to create. So with that, I'm just going to say thank you so much, first of all, to Nani, who has to run immediately to something else. Thank you so much for joining us, Nani. It was incredible to hear from you. Thank you. Thank you also to Asher Hemp. It's been a pleasure to spend some more time with you, Inc. I always learn so much. Rebecca, again, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to meet you and to spend this time with you, hear more about your work, and I hope that this is just the first of many meetings. And Vinishri, thank you so much again for your contributions, for your work, and Rebecca's to bring this discussion together, and for inviting me to be part of this as well. I've learned loads. I hope all of our attendees have, and you all have lots of fruitful conversations, reflections, and actions that come out of attending this week and this talk. So enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.